key teachings from the Buddhist tradition that Sangharakshita has kind of redeveloped to help us make sense of them in the modern world. And one of his key re-emphases that's been particularly important to me in his presentation of the Dharma is a teaching around a really key term in the Buddhist tradition called going for refuge. So going for refuge is a term that many of you may have heard about before, and it's an idea that comes up again and again in the Pali Canon, in the traditional oldest teachings of the Buddha's life that we have. And we often see in the Pali Canon when people come across the Buddha or his teachings, they spontaneously say, Buddham saranang gacchami, Dhammam saranang gacchami, Sangham saranang gacchami. I go for my refuge in the Buddha, in the Dharma, and in the Sangha. So this is an expression of their confidence and commitment in what we call the three jewels. So the Buddha, the highest vision of human potential, the Dharma, his teachings on the way things are that help us to realize this potential, and the Sangha, the community of people who are committed to realizing these teachings together. So for the early followers of the Buddha, the idea of going for refuge was really powerful and heartfelt declaration of this confidence and conviction in the three jewels as a sole refuge, so something that can give us security in an impermanent and suffering world, the one that we live in. And for many of them, this marked a really radical change. A lot of them, although not all of them, then they went forth into a life full-time following the Buddha's teachings. And it's over 2,500 years since the time of the Buddha. And going for refuge continues to be a concept that unites the Buddhist world, insofar as these refuge verses continue to be chanted by Buddhists across the world. But there's a sense in which, whilst the letter of this is alive, the spirit has, in some sense, the meaning and spirit of going for refuge is perhaps not as vital as it once was. So Sangharakshita saw this firsthand in the many years that he spent living in India, during which time he was ordained as a Theravadin monk. So he came to be quite critical of many aspects of traditional Buddhism. He called it spiritually moribund, which is quite a strong term. So it's critical of the extent to which many Buddhist monks, whilst going for the refuge in the sense that they had joined, they'd been ordained, they were monks, they lacked much by ways of spiritual vitality. So this sparked off a quest in Sangharakshita to re-examine and redefine the meaning of this term, going for refuge, and the centrality that it has in the Buddhist life. So a lot of this, he's really explored in a book that's been very important to me, and I really recommend that, some of you, particularly if you're training for ordination, have a look at this, called The History of My Going for Refuge. So I'm just going to talk about some of these key re-emphases that have been very important to me in my practice and understanding of what this term going for refuge means and how they've affected my life. So one important aspect of this redefinition of going for refuge is asking, well, what does it really mean to take refuge? What does it mean to take refuge in something? And what are we taking refuge from? So to me, a refuge is a place that gives us shelter. So shelter, security, safety from something that threatens us. And I think in our case, it's living in a world that is impermanent and unsatisfactory and doesn't always accord with our wants and with our desires. So it's a world that is inherently insecure. So this brings me to this first key re-emphasis of Sangharakshita's around going for refuge. We all go for refuge to something. So we all go for refuge to something. So going for refuge isn't just a Buddhist teaching. It's something that we do all of the time. So whether we're aware of it or not, we are all seeking security and happiness and meaning. And we're seeking these things precisely because we live in a world that can make these things very difficult to come by. So in this sense, we are all seeking a refuge. So when it comes to our happiness and security, what do we put our confidence in? What do we commit our energy and our ideals towards? Money, possessions, relationships, family, career, exciting experiences, pleasure, distraction. So these are some of the most common refuges that we seek in order to give us security, happiness, and meaning. And I think looking back on my life, particularly my early adult life, I can see myself taking refuge in all of these things to varying degrees. And, I was conditioned heavily by the society that we live in that encourages us to look to these things. But over time, my confidence in these things just wore down. So they weren't providing me with the happiness and security that I thought they would. And in many cases, ironically, seeking these things was causing me more unhappiness in all of that striving and chasing. And this is because these things are what Sangha calls false refuges. They can't provide us with the lasting happiness and security that we're looking for because, like us, these things are impermanent. And he teaches that we need to see and see through these false refuges if we're really going to meaningfully place our confidence in the three jewels. What the Buddha taught are the only true and meaningful refuges that we have. So this brings me to the second point that I wanted to bring up with regards to his re-emphasis of going for refuge. It is going for refuge that makes one a Buddhist. So Sangha has been really keen to point out in his own words that going for refuge is the central and decisive, indeed the definitive act of the Buddhist life. One does not go for refuge because one is a Buddhist, but one is a Buddhist because one goes for refuge. So the implications of this are quite far-reaching. It suggests that being a Buddhist is not about something that we believe, but something that we do through engaging in a path of committed action. So this was really important to me in my own journey, considering what this really meant. And in a sense, it's not enough. What it's saying is it's not enough to say, for example, yeah, I think the precepts are really great idea, I fully agree with them. In order for these teachings to provide us with a meaningful refuge, we have to put them into practice. So in this sense, we're only a Buddhist in a meaningful way to the extent that we place our confidence in and actually practice the teachings of the Buddha. And this is partly what is meant by going for refuge to the three jewels. So for me, I can trace this sense of starting to kind of meaningfully consider myself to be a Buddhist to the time that I became a Mitra. So I've been reading lots of books about Buddhism for many years. I kind of knew stuff about Buddhism and to a certain extent agreed with a lot of it. But it was only when I made that first real commitment to practicing being a Buddhist and practicing the Buddha's teachings in the context of this Sangha that the idea of being a Buddhist felt like something alive and meaningful to me. That was the beginnings of my going for refuge were what really led to and catalysed that experience. So the third and last point I want to draw out that's been significant to me in Sangharakshita's re-emphasis of this teaching is that going for refuge is dynamic and progressive. So what do I mean by this? So going for refuge is not something that we either do or don't do. It's something that is not something that happens just by repeating a magic formula. In order for our going for refuge to really provide us with that refuge we're seeking, it's something we have to engage in more and more deeply over time. And Sangharakshita has made sense of this by developing a teaching that he calls levels of going for refuge. And it's one that's been really, really useful to me. I don't have enough time to look at it in a lot of detail, but I'm just going to introduce some of the stages, the levels of going for refuge that I think are most relevant to us through the example of my own Dharma life. So firstly, Sangharakshita talks about cultural going for refuge. So this is often associated with ethnic Buddhism, so people who go for refuge to the extent that they live in a Buddhist culture, a culture that imbues their lives with certain sort of socio-religious observances. And they might do this, they might go to Buddhist temples and celebrate Buddhist festivals, but there isn't really any kind of meaningful engagement with Dharma practice. And this might not seem relevant to us in the West, but actually in my own case, I grew up in an environment where Buddhism was really a presence. So my mother was and is an order member, and clearly that has made an impression on me. So whilst it didn't leave me with much by ways of kind of understanding and active practice of the Dharma, it did leave me with positive associations, and that's really supported the development of my own going for refuge over time. And actually I can see Buddhism becoming more and more part of the culture that we live in. Seeds have been sown that lead people to come to places like the Sheffield Buddhist Centre. I was in John Lewis yesterday and there was a whole table full of Buddhas. You know, that iconography and some of the key teachings of Buddhism is alive in our culture. So beyond this cultural going for refuge, Sangharakshita talks about something called provisional going for refuge. So for our going for refuge to be effective, as I said, we have to actually begin to practice the Dharma, making a provisional commitment to the teachings of the Buddha, taught in the context of a particular Sangha. So without this, it's very hard to make progress and to experience the benefits of the Dharma. So the Buddha described the nature of the Dharma as suck it and see. He didn't literally say suck it and see. I think the Pali term is ehipassiko. But that it kind of is my best understanding of the spirit of what he was trying to say. So he says we've got to try it out for ourselves in order to see if it works and if it's effective. And through doing this, it's through doing this that our confidence in the Dharma begins to grow. And that confidence is the only meaningful basis from which we can go for refuge to the three jewels, or we can develop that further. So in the Triratna community, many make this provisional commitment when they become a mitra, which, as I already mentioned, was something that was particularly significant, a real key event in my own Dharma life, in terms of starting to make sense of what it meant to be a Buddhist to me, and to begin to go for refuge in a meaningful way. So the last level of going for refuge I'm going to talk about is what's termed effective going for refuge. Effective going for refuge. So many of you will know that I have recently returned from a 4-month ordination course in the mountains of Spain, during which time I was ordained into the Triratna Buddhist order. And the meaning of ordination in our tradition is very closely linked to this idea of going for refuge. And a person is ordained when those who know them well witness the effectiveness of their going for refuge. So what does this mean, the effectiveness of going for refuge? Well, in my Welcome Back talk, for those of you who were there, I talked a lot about confidence and commitment. And this is how I really make sense of what going for refuge or going for refuge effectively means. So effective going for refuge is about having a degree of confidence in the three jewels that allows you to commit more and more fully to placing these ideals, these refuges, right at the very centre of one's life. So we can't be forced to do this. It's something that has to grow naturally out of the deepening of one's practice. So we're no longer sucking and seeing, but placing our trust and confidence in the three jewels in a more committed and complete way. And this commitment can give rise to further confidence on the basis of which we can commit ourselves more fully, and so our going for refuge can develop. So as I said in that talk, this commitment for me really opened up doors in my practice. It enabled my going for refuge to become more and more effective in the sense that it supported me to live a more rewarding and happy and meaningful life for myself and hopefully for other people. And that sense was just so alive for me during my ordination course and since coming back. So this really is a kind of whistle-stop tour through this key representation of a teaching from the Buddha's time that Sangharakshita has re-emphasized in our tradition, and one that's been very key for me in making sense of what it means to be a Buddhist. And I hope it's given you a bit more of a sense of something of the meaning and importance of going for refuge, and how Sangharakshita has brought this teaching back home by reimagining the centrality of this teaching to the Buddhist life that we are all in some sense living. So ultimately what that life looks like is up to you. But I hope it's one in which you can continue to develop your confidence in the three jewels, in the Buddha, in the Dharma, and the Sangha, and receive the many blessings that these refuges can bring, as I and many others have and will continue to do so. So I'll leave things there before I get waved at again. Thank you.
The kind of inspiring Buddhist teaching that I wanted to talk to you about was one that I found incredibly moving when I first heard it, and it's called the parable of, or the myth of the return journey, and which I thought was quite apt, given that we're talking about bringing the teachings back home. So it's a story about someone coming home, actually. So I thought I'd just start by telling you the story, which is in a way the thing I'm most nervous about, actually, because I'm not used to telling stories, never mind to an audience. And then I'll just talk a little bit about why it was so meaningful for me in my life, and still is, actually. So this story is about a father and a son who are, at some point when the son's fairly young, they have some sort of a disagreement and they go their separate ways. So the son kind of leaves and he goes to somewhere far away and lives separately from his father. And in that time, he's incredibly poor and is basically just living hand to mouth, just trying to earn enough to pay for his next meal or the next bit of pleasure or whatever it is he needs. So a very, very basic sort of existence. And they live separately like this for years and years. And actually, while the son's kind of living this very, very basic existence, living totally at subsistence sort of level, his father is the other end of the scale. So he's kind of like getting more and more successful in trade, moving from place to place, and becomes quite a wealthy merchant. In fact, he becomes so wealthy that he's got kind of, absolute masses of riches, gold, jewels. He's got loads of servants, and he's even got elephants, which is kind of a real status symbol in ancient India. So he moves from place to place doing his trade, and eventually he settles down and has this beautiful, beautiful mansion where he lives, where he's tended to by all his servants and does all his trade from that one place. And sometime around that, I would maybe think, at least 10 years from when they first separated, the son finds himself in that town, not knowing where he is, obviously. But he's just gone there to find work because he's heard there's work there. By the way, this story's from the White Lotus Sutra, and I may well get details of it wrong, so forgive me if I do, and you already know it. But so I'm telling it from my perspective, partly. So anyway, so the son turns up in this town where the wealthy merchant is living, who happens to be his father, but he doesn't know. And he goes around looking for work, kind of skulking around, asking here and there, do you know if there's any work going, and not finding much. And eventually he finds himself in this kind of richer quarter, and he comes upon the mansion. And at the moment when he comes upon the mansion, his father is happening to be sitting outside his doorway, and it's like there's some sort of inventory going on of all his riches. So he's completely surrounded by piles of gold, silver, jewels. He's got a kind of beautiful ornate stool for his feet, which is completely encrusted in jewels, and a beautiful canopy covered in pearls and flowers, and someone's fanning him with a yak's tail, which is, again, a really good status symbol in ancient India. And so the son rounds the corner and he sees this scene. You can imagine elephants grazing in the beautiful fields as well. And he's just absolutely freaked out because he thinks that's just, no way am I going to be able to get work here. If anything, they're going to turn me into a slave. This is just, it's completely beyond me and my means. So I'm just going to leave before they enslave me. And so he turns and he leaves. Now, the father, at that moment, looks up. And although the son, in all his time, while he's been travelling around, has pretty much forgotten about his family, he's just concentrating on living, the father spots his son and he recognises him instantly. The whole time he's been gone, even though he's been getting wealthier and wealthier, he still loves his son, and he carries his absence like a pebble in his heart. He misses him. So he looks up and he instantly recognises his son, even though he's kind of emaciated and dishevelled. And he sends one of his servants straight away, "Go and get that man, bring him to me." And so the man runs after him, and the minute that he's he comes upon the son just faints away in terror because he's so scared of becoming enslaved by this rich guy and his servants. And the father sees this, and although he's a bit confused at first, he instantly then sees what's happened, and he spots that because him and his son have lived such different lives for the intervening years, that his son just cannot reconcile himself to that way of being. And so he very quickly thinks and says to his servant, "Release him." And the son, relieved, walks away. And the father turns to two other servants who are very much more humbly dressed and who this boy hadn't seen, and says, "Right, go after him. Just offer him work. There's a big pile of dirt out the back of the house. Get him to come and, offer him any pay that he wants to come and just move that dirt for me." And so these guys go after the son, and they offer him double pay and say, "Just come and do this work for us." And they're dressed kind of more lowly, more humble than the guys who went after him before. So this guy, obviously, he wants work, so he goes and he gets himself this little straw hut nearby, and he spends some time just shoveling this dirt away and wheelbarrowing it off into the countryside. I mean, some time, like 20 years or something, he spends just shoveling this dirt. Now, in the meantime, the father is quite, he finds it strange. He looks out and he sees his son out there shoveling dirt, and meanwhile he's living in this rich, wealthy lifestyle. So eventually he goes out and he puts himself in actually kind of quite scruffy clothes and goes out and speaks to the boy and he still doesn't tell him he's his father. He just says, "Look, anything you need, come to me, I'll give it to you. If you need, I've got a nice cloak, I've got some pots for your house." And he kind of makes some friends with him that way. And eventually he says to me, "Look, just treat me like your father, I'll treat you like my son." And so the boy, he's not a boy now, he's a man, begins to feel more and more comfortable. And eventually he's actually able to go in and out of the mansion without even noticing the difference between his own situation. And finally, the man actually says to him, "Look, you're doing such a good job and I trust you so much, I'm going to hand over the management of my affairs to you." And the guy becomes sort of like, I can't think what the word is. He kind of like takes over all the accounts and payments and everything like that. So he becomes even really used to handling the gold and handling the riches. And at this point, the son is actually starting to realise how his poor, hovelly lifestyle isn't actually all it's cracked up to be, and to kind of wish he was rich too. And around about then, the father actually starts to die. And so he draws around him everyone who's got any interest in his business and his son. And at that point, he tells everyone, "Actually, this is my son. I'm going to die, and now I'm passing all my wealth on to him." And the son becomes rich and is obviously shocked, surprised, happy, whatever you want to imagine. Okay, so that's the story, the parable of the return journey. It's about the son coming home. Why has this had such a profound effect on me? Because it has. When we first studied this in our study group, when I was doing Mitra study, I actually wrote an epic poem of the whole thing. I really loved it a lot. And when Satyajoti asked me to talk about something that inspired me, it was the first thing that sprang to mind, because it almost underlies a lot of how I think about my Buddhist practice. So just to say quickly, I'm not going to dwell on all the details too much, because I'll leave it to your own interpretation, but the father kind of represents the Buddha, and the son represents us on our journey towards enlightenment. So the first thing that really stands out to me about that is the fact that the father, it's his kindness and his wisdom. When he sees his son and he cares so much about him, he wants so much to reconnect with him, but he overrides that because he sees this isn't going to work. There's this huge psychological difference between me and him, because I'm used to this wealth and he's not. He just cannot. It's bringing fear up in him. And I find something very, very moving about that level of wisdom and kindness. I think it reflects how the Buddha actually did meet people with whatever teaching they needed to hear, even if it would be very different from the one he'd give the next person. But it also expresses something of my experience of spiritual friendship. So the way in which my spiritual friends and teachers, people a bit further along than me, seem to relate to my potential rather than actually how I am, which is a bit of a mess half the time. And that in itself is it pulls me on. It makes me want to be more than I am. So that the kindness and wisdom of the father, I find very, very moving. The other thing is his way of the fact that he transcends his initial desire to go and embrace his son. It sort of reminds me a bit of it's something a bit like the safety that Pradaya was talking about, that actually he's completely ethical and completely responsive to what is needed in that situation, so the reality of what's going on. And that in itself is reliable in a way that him just giving into his instant desire wouldn't be. So there's some safety in that, I think. It's kind of, I forgot to look at my time, but there's something I wanted to say about the son's first reaction and the way he faints away. And, oh God, okay, I'm not going to say too much about that, but it reminds me a bit of kind of how I experienced truth in a way when I first come across it. So, for instance, I can remember first meeting people who embodied what I see as the ideal. They just seemed so ethical and so aware and so kind. And I'd almost become tongue-tied and unable to speak, almost very aware of my own distance from that and my own unworthiness or feeling like that. And what I got met with, it reminds me a bit of being in love, how you kind of become really small. But in being in love, when that happens, there's a kind of power dynamic it plays into, whereas with my spiritual friends, that's met with kindness and patience, and they're now my great friends. Yeah. And then the final thing that I wanted to talk about, really the most important bit, I think, is just the fact that the son has to shovel that dirt for such a long time. And I just find that really immensely reassuring. So I think previously I used to be very much more like, I want everything, I want it now. You know, this whole path of regular steps, that's not for me, sort of thing. And then I'd get very confused and disheartened when my inspiration wore off. In fact, to the point of being quite hard on myself about why couldn't I sustain my inspiration? Why couldn't I sustain this sort of feeling of excitement in it all? And I remember when I was reading this, it coincided the first time I read it with realising actually how important it is to take the time to integrate all the different bits of myself, like even the little bits that weren't interested. So that kind of process of being really engaged and inspired and then pinging back and being kind of like vague and a bit disinterested and bored, that I actually find now, I suppose to give an example, while I was writing this talk, I wrote a bit and then I went on Facebook for a bit, and then I wrote a bit and then I went on Facebook for a bit, and I kind of felt like that's okay, because it's quite big and meaningful writing about this stuff, and I actually then, it's like my old familiar patterns and habits need a little bit of a say or something. And that reminds me of the son being able to go into the mansion and then having to go back to his hovel and then back into the mansion more and more until the hovel just doesn't appeal anymore. I was going to say something about how I find it reassuring that the father is still there all that time. Even he doesn't turn his back on the son, even though it's taking such a long time. He doesn't try and force him and push him forwards. He's just there waiting and ready for when the son is ready to come to him. And that's my experience in a way of the three jewels. I feel so incredibly lucky in a way. Like, I have friends here who embody the ethical precepts. And when I'm ready, as I am ready, bit by bit, I open up to that more and more. And the Buddhist teachings and the examples from his life is all there. It's kind of just gradually opening up to it. And the more you can do that when you're ready, the more fully it feels like I can take it on. And finally, just to say, because there's a bit of me that is incredibly grateful when I think about that, because I think, what if I didn't have that? You know, what if Sheffield Buddhist Centre wasn't here? And what if I'd never come into contact with the Dharma? But as well, there's a sort of mystery about it in which I think that it's no accident that it's like that. And I think it links in a bit to what Satyajoti talked about a few weeks ago when she was talking about the different levels of causation. So in a way, the son comes to the mansion because of his karma, because of his own actions. But once he's there, I think the Dharma Neama starts unfolding. So there's this kind of inevitability that he will more and more go into the mansion and that he will get more and more comfortable with it as long as he stays there, as long as he stays in touch with that process. So in a way, you know, our own actions brought us here to the Buddhist Centre, but now we're here. There's a certain sense in which we have to keep focusing on what we do, but there's also something else unfolding that's a bit more mysterious and deep. About 15 minutes now? Okay. Well, I would just say as well, then, since it's more or less, that I think there is there's even something about that Dharma Neama that was present before the son gets to the mansion. So even though it looks like he's just following his most basic needs in terms of finding food and getting some money, it still takes him somewhere that takes him much higher. And that actually, in a way, you may have come here because you felt stressed out and needed to relax. But in a way, it might take you somewhere higher. So the first thing that brought me to Buddhism was fancying someone who was a Buddhist when I was 18. And in a way, I think that's okay. Because, who knows what was going on underneath that? And I think my experience is that if I even look at my most basic seeming desires, they tell me something about my higher goals and where I want to be. I had some other little tales like that, but I won't confess too much. I just finish off by reading the final paragraph on this that Bhante says from his book on the White Lotus Sutra called The Drama of Cosmic Enlightenment. It's a brilliant, brilliant book. Where's it gone? Here it is. He says, religion, when properly understood, is not something remote from life, not just a dull, churchy little backwater, but life become conscious of its own upward tendency, its own tendency to grow and develop. And whether we know it or not, we are all involved, directly or indirectly, in this upward tendency of life. Each one of us is the poor man in the parable, the son who has run away. But each one of us also, if only we knew it, is the rich man, the father. And each one of us is making, even at this very moment, the return journey.
Okay, so the Dharma teaching that I'd like to speak to you about this evening requires a prop. So no words, no verses. The Dharma teaching is simply that, holding up a flower. And this is a teaching that the Buddha gave to an assembly of bhikkhus, an assembly of his disciples. And it said that only one disciple in the audience actually understood the meaning of that teaching. So this was a disciple called Maha Kasyapa. And when he saw the Buddha holding up the flower like that, Maha Kasyapa's response was just to gently smile. And it said that at that moment he attained enlightenment. He attained complete release from all suffering. So I just find that such a rich and mysterious teaching. So first of all, you've got Maha Kasyapa, the recipient of the teaching. So it said that Maha Kasyapa was the foremost of the Buddha's disciples in asceticism. So lived a very simple life. Like the Buddha, lived the life of a wanderer, wore a rag robe, had a bowl. They were the only possessions and would beg for his alms food. And obviously, living that kind of life, he's completely committed, completely devoted to following the Buddha's instructions, very devoted to the Buddha, and therefore receptive and able to catch these very subtle teachings that the Buddha was giving. So you've got Maha Kasyapa, and then you've got the Buddha. So the Buddha as an enlightened teacher, not just any old teacher, not just a wise person, not just somebody who's come up with a nice set of ideas and a few techniques, but an enlightened teacher. So as Pradaya was just saying about a true refuge, the Buddha was a true refuge in that sense, in that he had gone forth in search of and actually found a way to transcend the human predicament, a way to transcend all suffering in life and attain the great bliss. So I love those two aspects of the teaching, that you've got a disciple like Maha Kasyapa, and then you've got the Buddha as the enlightened one. But then there's the flower. So the really mysterious element in that particular teaching is the flower itself. So what is it that Maha Kasyapa is seeing when the Buddha holds up that flower? What is it that the Buddha understands that he's communicating in the holding up of that flower in the assembly at that particular moment? It's just profoundly mysterious. So to try to unpack the mystery of that teaching, I want to describe another similar experience to that of Maha Kasyapa in the life of our own teacher and the founder of the Triratna community. Sangharakshita. So in the late 1940s, this was before Sangharakshita had become Sangharakshita, before he'd been ordained, he spent 2 years of his life wandering in India, living a life much like Mahakashyapa in many ways. So he'd gone forth, sold his possessions, burnt his identity papers, and was just wandering from place to place with a companion, visiting different ashrams, going to different teachers, studying Buddhism, studying the Dharma, and practicing meditation. And at one point, somewhere between 1947 and 1949, he found himself at the ashram of Ramana Maharshi, a famous Hindu teacher. And he wasn't actually staying in the ashram, he was staying in a cave just on the outskirts of the ashram complex. And one evening he was sat in the cave, deep in meditation, and suddenly he had this vision. So he had this vision of the red Buddha, Amitabha. And it's very beautifully described in Bante's memoirs, this vision of Amitabha. So he describes how the colour of the Buddha was a deep, rich, luminous red, like that of rubies, yet soft and glowing, like the light of the setting sun. So he has this very vivid image of Amitabha. And Amitabha, as Bante saw him, was holding up in his hand, by the stem, a single red lotus flower. So very similar vision, if you like, to that of Mahakashyapa. And it's clear from the way that Bante describes that vision that he didn't just see a nice image of Amitabha. He didn't just see Amitabha holding up a flower. Just in the same way that Mahakashyapa didn't just see the Buddha Shakyamuni holding up a flower in the assembly. Both of them were seeing something more than that, something more than just the ordinary object. So something deeper. And it's worth reminding ourselves, I think, at this point, that Buddhism doesn't just speak to our intellect and to our rational mind. So Jenny's just spoken about the parable of the return journey, and that's a great example, again, of how Buddhism speaks in different types of ways to us, to try to engage different aspects of us, different parts of us. So the truth to which Buddhism points, it can't be fully expressed only in words. It can't be fully expressed only in concepts. So Buddhism also speaks the language of the depths. So it speaks the language of emotion, a language that engages the emotions, engages the imagination. And it does that through stories, through myths, through images, and through symbols. And it points to a truth, as I say, that's beyond all concepts, beyond all words, something that can only be experienced directly. So it's obvious then that Mahakashyapa, when the Buddha holds up the flower, was seeing in this kind of way. So he was seeing the truth directly, something unmediated by concept. He wasn't just seeing a flower. And Bante too, in that vision of Amitabha, the way he was relating to that experience, he was also seeing a deeper truth, if you like, a hidden meaning, something that it contained that wasn't immediately apparent in a kind of way that we can understand only through words. So he described that vision, or he described his interpretation of that vision in his memoirs. So rather than just seeing a nice image of Amitabha, the way that Bante reflected and interpreted that vision was that it was time for him to stop the wandering. It was time for him to stop going from teacher to teacher and to actually commit himself to being ordained as a Buddhist monk at that particular time. So again, he left this cave and set off on a journey to seek ordination. So I think that the reason I'm drawn to this teaching of the Buddha holding up the flower to Mahakashyapa is that it is an invitation to enter into that world of deeper meaning, the world of symbolic meaning. It's an invitation to go beyond the limits of merely rational, conceptual understanding of the thinking mind. Unfortunately, Sangharakshita has given us a way, or the way that he's presented the Dharma and translated the Dharma to us, he's given us a way that we can actually practice entering into that world of deeper symbolic meanings. And I know you've been exploring this theme of bringing it all back home, and I think this is one of the great gifts that Sangharakshita has given us, is practices that allow us to step into that world, if you like, of undefined meanings, even undefinable meanings. So I think there are many ways that he's done that. I just want to talk about two in particular. Two ways that Bhante has helped us to step into this way of understanding things on a deep, non-conceptual level. So firstly, one of the things that Sangharakshita has emphasized is the importance of the arts and engaging with the arts and exploring the arts. So he doesn't recommend this just for our entertainment, although we do enjoy, personally I enjoy exploring the arts. It's not just about entertainment or impressing our friends or anything like that. It's enjoying the arts because they do open up to us that realm of deeper meanings. So if we take, for example, a poem is not just a collection of words on a piece of paper, is it? Or if we take a piece of music, it's not just the arrangement of various sounds. That would completely devalue our experience of things like poetry and music if we considered them merely in that way. So when we read poems, when we read stories, when we listen to pieces of music, there's more to them, if you like, than the sum of their parts. They really evoke something for us and touch the depths in us. They really can move us emotionally. So I think the more we explore the arts in this kind of way, the more receptive we can become to that truth that's beyond concept and that is always communicating itself to us if only we were open to it and if only we could see it. And secondly, I think the second aspect of our approach to the Dharma that can help us to see the deeper meanings, the deeper significance in the midst of ordinary experience is Bhante's emphasis on the importance of metta, so on the importance of loving kindness. So through metta practice, whether it's the the metta bhavana meditation practice, or whether it's just trying to contact metta in the midst of our lives, relating to others on the basis of metta, of loving kindness, I think what we're really trying to see is to see beyond our habitual labels. So see beyond people as friend, as enemy, difficult person, to see beyond people as strangers, to see beyond the way we can sometimes categorize people in terms of, like him, like her, don't like him, don't like her. It's an encouragement to really see beyond those things and actually see other people and see the mystery that is another person. And this can be so liberating, can't it? So I'm sure it was similar for lots of you, but when we start to consciously, somebody's waving a little thing at me, and I'm wondering what the symbolic resonance is. Thank you. When we start to engage with metta practice, it can be so liberating because we do put down that categorization and that conceptual labeling of people as this or that, and we start to enter into the mystery of being around other people and relating to other people. And we get a taste of that, don't we, in the fifth stage of the metta bhavana, where we bring more and more people to mind and we break down those barriers that we habitually put in place. And ultimately, I think the practice moves us more and more into the realm, or into a realm, that is beyond our usual way of seeing things altogether, beyond a sense of self separate from other. And I think this is why Bhante emphasizes the metta bhavana as an enlightenment practice. So a practice that can actually take us all the way to enlightenment, because it takes us all the way beyond helps us to transcend that categorization of a separate, independent self in opposition to others. And just to bring to mind another image, that's also the way that we can understand the Buddha as relating to people and seeing people. So after the Buddha's enlightenment, he had this amazing vision of the world of human beings as being like a great pool of lotuses. So all living beings are growing much like lotuses. And I've never been to India, I've never seen a lotus in the flesh, if that works. But apparently they grow out of very thick, swampy water, dirty water, difficult terrain. And they come up out of the water, grow far from the surface, and flower as these beautiful, amazing, radiant-coloured flowers. And the Buddha sees that human beings are just like that. They all have the potential to grow out of difficulty, grow out of suffering, and flower into something really amazing. So I think perhaps there's something of that, isn't there, in that teaching to Mahakashyapa. So when the Buddha holds up the flower to Mahakashyapa, maybe he's communicating something in that moment of that way of relating to life and of that way of relating to other people. And perhaps it's this that Mahakashyapa starts to understand and responds with that gentle smile. So I'm going to finish with a poem. It seems appropriate to finish with something like a poem rather than trying to conceptually tie everything together that I've just said. So this poem, I'm sure you'll see the resonances in it with what I've said. It's called The Golden Flower, and it's one of Sangharakshita's poems that I think he wrote sometime in the 80s. So love grew up between us like a flower, though neither made a sign or breathed a word, content to watch it growing hour by hour, and see its petals by the breezes stirred. At length it grew to such a breadth and height, it stood there like a mighty forest tree, with 1,000 glorious petals golden bright, and I could not see you, nor you see me. And so the flower for both is all in all, though each is in the flower in each, and each in each forever past recall, a mystery this, beyond the grasp of speech.